welcome to the second lecture in our Human Rights Lecture series here at the Issam Institute. Thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce you now to our speaker, Dr. Nicolas Pouillard, who graduated from the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. He's now a researcher in political science at the French Institute of Near East, IFPO, in Beirut. He has been senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Tunisia in 2010-2011, and his most recent publication for the ICG is entitled Popular Protests in North Africa and the Middle East, which is number 4, Tunisia's Way. Today he'll be speaking on unfulfilled justice in Tunisia, the slow motion reforms of justice and security sectors, and he'll be speaking for about 20 to 30 minutes, and after that we'll have a Q&A for about another half hour or so. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thanks a lot. To begin, I should previously say that I'm not a specialist of transitional justice and human rights or democratic transition in general. I never worked, in fact, specifically on these topics before. But I spent 8 months in Tunisia after the January 14 revolution as an analyst for an international think tank, which is the International Crisis Group, so maybe you know it. And at first, it was the whole political and revolutionary situation and the whole political landscape that interested me. Then I began, step by step, after some 3 or 4 months, research focused on the reform of justice sector and security sector. Because it was quite impossible for me to understand the general structure of the old Bourguibist and Benalist regime without understanding its 4 main pillars. At first, the political police, of course. 2, the justice, which was totally under the command of the presidential palace. 3, the political party, the National Democratic Gathering, the RCD. And 4, the medias. These 4 pillars all together were naturally totally interconnected. And at the same time, it's worth noting that this system and these 4 pillars had produced on the middle term their own resistances. For instance, the National Order of Lawyers and the Association of Tunisian Magistrates, since the end of the 90s, were strong political bastions of the opposition to President Ben Ali. Before starting, I would like to add something else. Ben Ali didn't invent anything. I say it because there is something strange in Tunisia, you know, actually, in some political or intellectual spheres, which are trying to draw, you know, a golden age, the age of President Bourguiba until the coup d'etat of 1987, and after, you know, dark times with President Ben Ali. It's wrong because Ben Ali totally inherited a political and security system. For instance, the law regulating the Supreme Council of the Magistrature is the Bourguibist law of 1962, without any separation between the judiciary power and the executive power, because it was the President of the Republic who was in charge of the nominations of a judge. The current law organizing the Interior Ministry has been enacted in 1982 under Bourguiba's reign and was only reinforced in 1991 by President Ben Ali. And it's worth noting too that the structures, all the structures of the security apparatus under Bourguiba were partly inherited from the French mandate. So it means a strong reform of these sectors is all the more difficult that the system is deeply rooted in a long-term history and in a long historical wave. So why I named this lecture Unfulfilled Justice in Tunisia? Because before speaking about transitional justice or national reconciliation, or instead of speaking of transitional justice or national reconciliation, we should talk simply at first about justice. I mean the lack of justice and the question of impunity. The global problem for me is that sometimes, you know, these very general concepts, I mean transitional justice, democratic transition, new governance, national reconciliation are very far from the reality, acting as a sort of construction of a reality, thinking in terms of models and advocating, in fact, a sort of new statu quo with the past. And if I have to talk about reforms, about justice, about security, about police, I have at first to take into consideration the view of subalterns. I have at first to take into consideration the question of reforms by the bottom, not by the top. Maybe you know the question asked during the 80s by the Indian literary critic Gayatri Spivak, can the subaltern speak? And I was in Tunisia at first interested in what these subalterns coming from the poor regions of Tunisia had to tell me and had to tell us. Why? Because it is in the central provinces of Tunisia that the insurrection against the Ben Alist system began. In Sidi Bouzid, which is now internationally well known with the figure of Mohamed Bouazizi, but also in towns like Kasrin and Tala and Le Kef and so on. And since the fall of Ben Ali, demonstrations, sit-ins, social explosions for 1 year now never stopped. And if you listen to the claims of the young and jobless demonstrators in this region, you will hear two main requests: jobs, of course, and justice. And in their own words, justice only signifies a better judiciary system. So it means that today, in a way, question of justice is also a sort of social question. Why? Because just after the revolution, the main political and police leaders, governors, police officers who were organizing the repression during the insurrection, who gave orders and who committed murders, have not been charged for anything, have not gone to courts in their vast majority. Some police officers, for instance, just after the fall of Ben Ali, have just been transferred by the Interior Ministry to another regions, often to Monastir or to Sousse or to Binzert on the Tunisian coast. Some of these officers sometimes were promoted. Concerning the exactions and abuses committed by the police during some demonstrations after the revolution, the internal inquiries of the Interior Ministry have not been followed by the different ministers. So what are saying now and what are denouncing now the young demonstrators of the central and southern regions? Impunity is very simple. And this deep feeling of impunity doesn't concern only the central and southern regions of the previous insurrection. It's a general problem. I can say it's the whole problem, because cases of torture in Tunisian prisons haven't stopped. Police violence is still visible, especially during demonstrations and strikes. There is the example of a demonstration of May 6, which was a shock with cases of abuses and torture just after the demonstrations, but with also an attack of the police on the local of the main trade union, on the office of the trade union, the UGTT, and against the daily newspaper La Presse near Bourguiba Avenue, which is the central avenue in Tunis capital. Same abuses of the police appeared during the so-called Casbah-free demonstrations against the Belgica Decepsi government in July and in August. So we can say that there is a sort of total continuity with the past in terms of general methods. And the question now in Tunisia is not, for example, national reconciliation between parts of the old regime and the rest of the Tunisian society. The main question in Tunisia now is the struggle against impunity. And the struggle against impunity is all the more difficult that the judiciary sector is literally sick and inefficient, with only 2,100 judges for, by comparison, 8,000 lawyers. There is a clear lack of skill in the profession in terms of struggle against corruption. For instance, the judiciary police is in the same situation without any skill or clear trainings, with reduced staff and resources. And I want to say that the tragic contradiction lies in that, because on the one hand, people are asking for a better justice and for the end of impunity, but it needs, on the other hand, a strong and clean judiciary sector. But this clean and strong judiciary sector doesn't exist at all. For the moment, it is very, very weak. So it's a contradiction, and it seems to be, like a dead-end street, I mean. So if you take all these elements altogether, I mean continuity with police system, unorganized justice, lack of trials, families of martyrs and of injured people who demonstrate in the central provinces of the country, independent judges and lawyers who criticize the lack of reform in the sector of justice. Of course, you have a lot of grievances, and the lack of clear reforms, of political willingness in these domains, of political willingness, I mean, coming from the top, coming from the transitional governments, as a direct outcome in the central and southern regions, a real hunger persists. And the hypothesis of a new social explosion now in these regions, due to the lack of justice, due to the feeling of impunity, it's not an abstraction, democracy or not, elected government or not, constitutional assembly or not. So maybe we can say that for this reason, there are two views and two conceptions, in fact, of the transition and of the reforms in Tunisia now. One of these, it is of course the radical and revolutionary vision defended by the regents of insurrection, but also by a large part of the civil society. Lawyers, independent magistrates, some human rights associations and nets. A vision that says that the process of reform is evidently too slow and that the revolutionary process cannot advance without a clear and radical break with the past. But there is another vision and another option that still exists, maybe more reformist or moderate or more gradual, I don't know. It's a vision shared by a large part of political elites, from the first government of Mohamed Ranouchi until the last government of Bejikai Dessepsi. It is maybe a more positive vision, saying, and that's partly true, saying that a series of reform in a very short term, I mean less than 1 year, have been engaged. And saying that nothing has been done could be unfair and could be untrue, and I can easily admit it. For instance, the Democratic National Gathering, the RCD, the former ruling party, has been dissolved in February. In February 2011, the same month, two independent commissions against corruption, violences, and abuses were created. And it's true that their investigative works have been enormous, undoubtedly, but at the same time, a problem remains because these commissions, for instance, have only a consultative function, and their ultimate goal is only to make, a series of recommendations for the present government and for the President of the Republic. On the other hand, some positive steps occurred this last month inside the Interior Ministry. The State Security Direction, the DSS, which was the main apparatus for the political police, which was in fact at the top of the political police, has been dissolved in March. During the same period, 40 high officers of the Interior Ministry were fired, and the Bejikai Dessepsi government recognized at this time officially the necessity to break with the logic of political police. Another positive sign has been, I think, 6 months ago, the foundation of an independent trade union for security forces, led by policemen not involved previously in corruption or in exactions. And this trade union has engaged a real dialogue with some human rights movements and with some former opponents, and pledged for a deep and sincere reform of the Interior Ministry. And in a way, it was a sort of revolution, because it was the first time in Tunisian history that existed a direct connection and a direct dialogue between former opponents, whether Islamist or leftist, and policemen. The SFC government made last significant step in July 2011 with the nomination of Lazar Akremi, a lawyer and the former political opponent coming from the left, as Minister of Interior in charge of reforms. So this policy of step-by-step reforms is not definitely a failure, I mean. And now policy of step-by-step reform seems to be continued now by the new elected government led by Mr. Hamad Ishbeli, the former General Secretary of the Islamist Ennahda party. But I think that there is no difference, because with this new government, which is, a sort of alliance between some Islamist parties and leftist parties, and which is a government elected, and I'm not here to make an analogy of this government, but with this government, Tunisia has taken a very symbolic step. The new president of the Republic, Mr. Monsef Marzouki, is an historical opponent to Ben Ali and has spent more than 10 years in exile. The new Prime Minister, Hamad Ijbeli, one of the leaders historically of the Islamic movement in Tunisia, was imprisoned for 16 years. The new Minister of Interior, and it's a symbol, the new Minister of Interior, Khalil Al-Harif, more than 20 years ago, knew the basements, of the Interior Ministry, because he has been tortured there. Of course, it's only symbols. But this government has created, for example, a new ministry dedicated to human rights, the rule of law, and transitional justice, led by Mr. Samir Dilou, who is an Islamist lawyer, very involved during the past in the defense of political prisoners. And these are, of course, only symbols, but we cannot deny at the same time that something, in a way, has changed in Tunisia. So there are positive signs. But the problem is that there is a sort of equal balance between negative signs and positive signs. And the problem is not to know who is right, who is wrong between the step-by-step reform partisans and the more radical claims of central and peripheral regions. The major problem now is the radical division and the lack of understanding between the central regions, which feel totally abandoned by the state and by all political elites after the revolution, and on the other hand, the transitional governments. The second problem is the lack of global and coordinated vision on these topics: justice, security, police, and so on. The debate on transitional justice, for example, in Tunisia now, for the moment, is nothing more than an abstract debate conducted by some human rights nets during international conferences, really. And the problem too is with all political parties in general, because before the elections for Constitutional Assembly in October 2011, programs of political parties were very vague on these topics. Whether Islamist, radical leftist, liberals from the right or from the left. It was only general considerations, about the necessity to separate the executive power from the judiciary power, to develop a republican police respectful of human rights. It was very, vague. And politically, I can understand that all the new political elites that emerge just after the revolution do not want to go too fast, because they fear with strong and radical political measures to provoke a sort of violent reaction coming from the old security apparatus. And it's true, it's a possibility which is totally open. That is why these new political elites want, in a way, a sort of political accommodation with part of the old regime and with part of the old security apparatus. But at the same time, and here is the fundamental contradiction, it cannot stop the deep feeling of anger, pain, and frustration coming from the regions of insurrection. So the lack of reforms, the slowness of reforms of justice sector and security sector became, this last month, a sort of mirror of an historical division between two Tunisia. Because one Tunisia is asking for strong reforms and radical changes in terms of security policies, in terms of justice, in terms of struggle against impunity, torture, and corruption. And another Tunisia is asking for slow motion and gradual reforms. And in this division, you can see also a division between Tunis, the capital in the north, with all its administrations and all its ministries, and on the other hand, the central and southern regions. It is, a fundamental division between the center and the periphery. And if I'm speaking about justice, security, police, reform, etc., I cannot put aside this structural and historical spatial division of the power. And in a way, the topic of reforms of justice and security apparatus, the question of struggle against impunity, will be, of course, a real test for the Tunisian revolution and for the so-called democratic transition. Because if some very positive signs are realized in terms of reforms and changes in these fields, it will be maybe a significative step to pass through this legacy of a Bourguet-based and Ben Ali system, which is the total abandonment of the peripheric regions, which is a total abandonment of the south and of the center of Tunisia. But unfulfilled, it will only signify that the central and southern regions will remain the same. I mean, subaltern and revolted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pouillard. At this time, we'll take some questions. And if you raise your hand, I can give you the microphone and please introduce yourself and your name and where you come from. And keep your questions short as possible. Okay.
Thank you very much for this valuable presentation. My name is Amna Belali. I come from Tunisia. And I'm representing Human Rights Watch in Tunisia. While I share your conclusions and views that there is kind of half-hearted reform initiatives in Tunisia that didn't really lead to maybe a radical change, I have some reservations on your conclusions regarding impunity. Because you didn't mention that there are some trials which are ongoing now in the military courts, because they have competence, they have jurisdiction on crimes committed by either soldiers or members of the security forces against either their fellow security forces colleagues or against civilians. So the question of jurisdiction is because that's why they are tried in the military courts. But there is also a very interesting reform of the military justice system that tried to ensure its independence from the defense ministry. And I'm quite following these trials. I find it quite difficult to conclude a blanket conclusion that there is impunity in this regard, because there are, well, the persons who are tried are very high-level officials. There is the president, in absentia, of course, trial, but there are also 2 ministers of interior and 40 officers. I mean, it's one step further than just saying it's impunity. And of course, there are many problems in these trials, and I think that it would be very interesting to follow up on that and on these problems. But it's one of the issues that might also add to this more nuanced, maybe, view about the question of impunity. The other issue I wanted to raise or to discuss with you is the fact that, well, with this new Ministry of Human Rights and Transitional Justice, do you think this would advance a little bit the discussion about transitional justice? Because it's true, I agree totally with you that it was quite an abstract and very vague term that was quite like a bubble. The transitional justice in civil society parlance was very much a mode, kind of nouvelle mode. But maybe there is new developments now with this new government. I don't know what's your view about that, because I still think we might have some hope in this new ministry, but well, I also have my doubts, but would be interested to know more about it. Thank you very much.
We'll take maybe 2 questions.
To stay on the same subject and need of additional éclaircissement, should I say. I'm with you. Can you give us more insight on the quantitative aspects of these different types of sectorial justice? There is the military justice, there is the civil rights, there is the commercial law, there is the foreign investment, defense and things like that, which gives maybe the facility for Tunisia. Tunisia is a French tradition law or Napoleon law and things like that, and they can get the advantage of these to look what's happening in the European countries to structure more this sector and not be only centralized in one single court of justice or whatever, and the struggle between the center and the provincial area. These aspects is also mentioned by Ms. To give us a hope that something is progressing and they can abound in the recruitment of the needed basis to let this justice becoming a better future. Just to quantitative aspects.
Thank you. We just have one more question.
Well, I will follow up with your question, last one about transitional justice. Well, I was surprised when I saw the cabinet composition that transitional justice suddenly appeared. I think this is the first minister in the world called the Minister of Human Rights and Transitional Justice, and they picked the name of the minor I created here at UB. Human rights and transition. This is just a joke. Okay, now I followed the debate on transitional justice, and at certain point it was controversial about this term. Even I heard the debate in the TV where someone say what's so-called transitional justice, as if they understood it as half justice, as if it's a qualification of justice. Actually, it's not a qualification of justice, it's a qualification of countries in a transition. So justice is specific to country in transition. So in any case, can you tell us a little bit about this debate? This is my first point. The second and last point, I was really very interested in how you show us that the debate on justice, it's very related to social classes and to center peripheries. So we have often an abstract conception of justice, that it's a victim versus perpetrators. No, it's much more complex. People are much more interested in justice than others, etc. Can you elaborate on social class and justice, please, as a concept? Yeah, thank you.
It's okay. Concerning at first the army and the military courts, it's true that you have some trials with military courts now, but I'm not so positive. At first, because I think that there is a legend now constructed in Tunisia about the army and about the role of the army historically and especially during this revolution. The army didn't sustain the revolution by itself or because they are so humanist. It's just because they saw the general balance of power in the country in mid-January, and it was a political decision at a certain time, and especially it was a political decision at the end of the process, because the insurrection began in mid-December, and the decision of the army and of General Rashid Ammar, that's it. It was only the 12th or 14th of January, after the general strike of the UGTT. I mean, the decision of the UGTT, the main trade union, to participate and to declare a general strike was partly a reason for the army to decide to abandon Ben Ali. So it was a political decision, and we haven't to forget that historically, in 2008, especially in Gefsa, the army participated in the repression of the insurrection in Gefsa, because in 2008 you had a pre-revolution in a way in the extreme west of the country, and the army participated in it. So in general, I'm not so positive about the role of the army. Secondly, yes, there is a process of reforms of these courts, of these military courts, but these reforms arrived just after some mobilizations of families in the regions. And these families at the beginning didn't accept the military courts, because they said this is a system which is very opaque, and we are not able to to work with it, and we don't trust them. And I think it's still the case, because for the moment it's just the beginning of this trials, but we don't know the final decisions, of course. But I'm not so positive, and I think it's a larger discussion on the role and on the nature of the army in Tunisia. And it's important to note too that the army, especially under Belgique and the SFC government, played a real role in the reinforcement of the security system, because the interior ministry is very weak and is very divided inside. Is divided between policemen from the trade union and the head of the ministry. So Belgique and SFC, who is the former minister of interior during Bourguiba's period, had a clear agreement with the army, but it wasn't an agreement around the order only. It was an agreement about the remaking of security order, I think. And this story is not finished. That's why I'm not so positive on this. On this topic. Concerning the Ministry of Transitional Justice, it's a positive step by itself. I mean, it's a symbol, and there is this deep symbol that effectively the Minister of Transitional Justice and Human Rights is led by Samir Dilou, that you may know. Samir Dilou was really is a member of the direction of the Islamist party, but was too a real figure of the human rights movement in Tunisia, especially in the defense of political prisoners. So the symbol, especially in this period, is very important. The only problem, but it is a real problem, is that Samir Dilou is Minister of the Human Rights and the Transitional Justice government ministry, but at the same time is the Speaker for the government. So you can easily understand that there is a problem, because maybe there is a risk. I mean, that he will be the official voice, you know, of some problems. I mean. So that's why this Ministry of Transitional Justice now is so criticized by the Human Rights League and some associations and human rights movements. To give you an aspect on the quantitative aspects, it's very about what? About the Interior Ministry, about the army, but I can say that the army historically, it's true, is weak. In Tunisia it was 30,000, around 30,000 soldiers, in fact. So it's very weak. The Interior Ministry, contrary to the army, it was around 60,000 people. So it's you can. I mean, Tunisia, it's not like Egypt, for example. The role of the army in Tunisia has been historically limited by Bourguiba and by Ben Ali too. That's why the role of the army is very ambiguous at this time, because maybe they are trying to play a new political role in the political game, actually, because they have been weak by the past. They played a real role during the revolution, and now they are renegotiating, you know, their place and their function in the Tunisian system. But maybe you won't.
Is there any balance between the number of cases and the number of preparatory steps to put forward the claim in a special section of the justice? I mean, the civil right, the commercial law, the penal law is three different type of justice process. So, to compare with other countries, what should we what should we doing in Tunisia to fill the gap between the need and the processes and the relevant administrative area around the justice to make these reforms advancing the whole story of justice. And impunity is also a number of cases abandoned and cases followed, and there is a processes of help to be helped by the technology at the end. Is there anything by writing and by foot, and you have to make a long queue before depositing any proper claim? Can they not be helped by the processes of the information technology and things like that? Are they thinking about twinning some sort of procedure in Tunisia, like in other countries, to impact at the end what's in the mind of the people when they have started this revolutionary process? Because, of course, if they keep on postponing all the way anything to be done, it will be a lost opportunity for everybody. So, to my view, it is about time to establish a sort of proportionality, how many lawyers should be resident here and there, against how many number of cases or how many number of population sourcing the necessity of the justice processes. This type of vision is probably not seen or not yet enough documented to address through maybe European Union or World Bank or whatever the necessity of planning a long term but a short term also, step by step, rather than waiting for the creative number of ministries or political people of goodwill, of course, but that's not enough. So who's going to start with this ball? That's the question.
But I can only say that concerning the reforms for the moment, in fact, it's very simple. I mean, concerning, for example, the justice, there is...
compared to Lebanon.
Yeah, it's a very different case.
But still, it's a very weak system.
I know.
If you compare
Sorry,
Lebanon...
can we allow him to answer the question first?
Yes.
I have another question, we'll do another round of questions. Are there more questions?
I haven't finished, but I will. No, I will finish for Sari and okay, I can take over questions. Yeah, it's okay.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the role of international organizations that work on transitional justice issues in Tunisia. Are they playing a role? What sort of role are they playing? And maybe if you could speak a little bit to some of the obstacles to them playing a greater role in the context. I would guess, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, particularly in regard to capacity building, because you mentioned sort of, the lack of acumen of some of the judges and whatnot in the courts.
Any other questions right now?
I just wanted to touch on the issue of impunity, because it brings up a question of why impunity. And for me, when you talk about impunity, it's either that the judiciary system that is already existing is unwilling or incapable. And when just quick look at the judiciary in Tunisia, we know that there's a big division among the judges themselves, among the association of the judges and the syndicate of judges, and the rhetoric of whether they should first purge the judiciary from judges who are perceived to be agents of the former regime, or whether to go for reforms at the beginning and go for a new law that governs the magistracy. So how do you think ongoing judicial reform, because there are initiatives right now for judicial reform, how do you think these initiatives would impact impunity in the future?
Okay. No. Okay. Yeah, concerning this question of impunity, effectively the Association of Tunisian Magistrates, which were very involved during these last years around the struggle against Ben Ali's system, it's one of its demands now. I mean, the system has to be purged. It's clear, and it's an official demand. It's not they don't say that it should be, I mean, a witch hunt, but we know that effectively some judges maybe have to be judged, in fact. Because they were totally part of a political system, and I said at the beginning of the lecture that the system of the Supreme Council of the Magistrature, it was the President of the Republic, it means Ben Ali just before, who was in charge of the nomination of judges. So yes, there is a big problem in this sector because you have to renew this sector from the bottom to the top, and I say too that the big problem and the important problem with this sector it is a weak sector because you have only 2,100 judges, and it's a real problem in terms of capacity, in terms of general capacity. So it's a question because it's going to take a very long time to renew this sector, to reinforce this sector in terms of personnel. I mean, so it will be very, very, very long, but they know the solution because there are solutions now. One of the solutions is a real reform, primarily of the Supreme Council of the Magistrature. I mean, there is a deal between the Association of Tunisian Magistrates now and the Hamad Eshbeli government around the Transitional Supreme Council, but it's not clear because for the moment the new judges and the new magistrates of this council are not going to be elected, and this is a demand of part of the magistrates and part of the trade unions of the magistrates. We have a right to elect the Supreme Council of the Magistrature. Maybe part of the Supreme Council will be elected and part will be nominated, but we have to be part of this rebuilding of the Supreme Council. So this is the first step. The question of the Supreme Council and the question of a reinforcement in terms of staff of the sector of justice is it's a priority now. Concerning the role of international organizations, they played, at first, it's true that they played a role indirectly, historically, and before the fall of Ben Ali, because you had you had the sections, the Tunisian sections, for example, of Amnesty International, I think Human Rights Watch. Maybe you had done the sections, but you had some correspondence on place. So there were plenty of international and European international human rights organizations, and that's a very good point because now all these human rights associations can open offices, can have official staff in the country, but they knew the situation previously, so they are not totally lost. It's not the same situation, I don't know, as in Libya, for example. Now the role of these international organizations is of course central, but they have to wait something, because the real problem is not with international organizations, it is with the Tunisian human rights organizations, because these Tunisian human rights organizations now are saying that they have a real problem, because previously they were used to struggle against a dictator, you know. And for them, they are saying no. Before it was very easy for us to make activism, you know. It was demonstrations. Maybe sometimes it was, of course, prison and so on. But life, in a way, was very simple. Now we have to change all the things, all the meanings, all the way to act in the Tunisian society. We are not struggling against a dictator. We are building a democracy. So for us, it's very hard. For example, I was in Beirut with some human rights activists from the Tunisian Human Rights League, and he said, you know, it's horrible now because many people who know the Human Rights League now come in our office and are asking, for example, for a job or for a letter for the governor for having a job and so on. So we don't know how to deal with this new situation. We are not a charity movement, we are a human rights league, you know. So in fact, they are lost, and it's very difficult for international human rights organizations to help Tunisian organizations, because Tunisian organizations are partly lost in the new and the current political situation. Concerning just to finish with sorry, because I didn't answer, but. The problem is that your question needs theoretical and a long theoretical reflection, and I tried just to begin it. I can just only say that I was very surprised between the months of February and October by the mobilizations in the central and southern regions around this topic. It was totally new, because often when you see social movements, or especially coming from poor areas and very subaltern areas, in general the main demand is jobs or social justice. There it was amazing, because all the sit-ins, the official demands of the sit-ins, with, you know, posters and photos of the martyrs, with all the injured people making hunger strike and so on. It was a real reform of the judiciary system. It was a social demand, you know. So that's why I tried to emphasize it in my lecture, because for me it was the first time I saw it, you know, this demand of reform in terms of judiciary demands. So. And maybe, I don't know, for social sciences, it could be yes, a question, classes and justice. You know, it's yes, it's new.
We'll take a last round of questions now, if there are any more. Yes, and please remember to identify yourself, your name.
Transitional Justice class. I just wanted to ask, because we were discussing this earlier, that you mentioned that some police officers were either transferred or promoted. And I was just wondering. I was just wondering how do you suggest that Tunisia should deal with that case, or should they all be prosecuted, even those that were given special orders to, like you mentioned, how they were related to repression and how they implemented repression in Tunisia. Do you suggest they all be prosecuted? Because that also could have certain implications. And I was also wondering if you are sort of implying or saying that it's a positive thing if, I know it's very different from the Lebanese case, but if you're implying that international intervention should occur in Tunisia, that could also have certain implications. Thank you.
Are there any last questions? Okay.
No, about these officers who have been sometimes often transferred from the central and southern regions to the north. I have just to add before that it's not new, because until now, just after the insurrection of Gefsa in 2008, it's the same thing, you know, because it's little towns in general, and it's the argument of the Interior Ministry. We cannot keep these guys waiting for their trials, etc. We cannot keep these guys in this town because it's maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people in this town, so everybody knows him, and his family is taking a risk. And yes, it's a reality. His family is taking a risk, and himself, I mean. But at the same time, we know that this argument of the Interior Ministry was false, because when you adopt a series of promotions for some of these officers, it's a real problem, and it's a tradition. For example, there is the case of Khaled Ben Said, who was vice-consul of Tunisia in France at Strasbourg. He has been charged by the French justice some years ago for the rape of a woman who belonged to the Islamist movement in 1994 or 1996. And Khaled Ben Said has just been transferred from France to Tunisia, and now he's a police officer, very well known in a very well known town. You know, so it's a tradition. So me, I have no solution for it. I'm not here I'm not judge, and I'm not but yes, if they have to be, if they should be charged for something, it should be done. It should be done because. In many cases, their names are well known. I mean.
Thank you very much. If there's no further questions, just sure.
My name is Talal Abdurrahman, political science student. With Tunis, I was wondering, it's really a big question, but I'm wondering if Tunis is a different case. Is it because it's socially developed in order to face and these issues and tackle these issues and realize the targets that they have in reform, whether it's judicial or in the army or in the case of this, because in Egypt, which also has not the revolution, Yemen was also, I wouldn't call it a proper revolution, but somehow he left power. So is Tunis really different from the other states in the Arab world, I guess?
Yeah. I take another question and I can answer about this.
From the French Institute near Orient. Got a quick question with regard to what you say about the extradition of the guy from France. I was wondering what's the position of, let's say the Western powers toward this transitional process in terms of how should they cooperate? And my question will be a bit more narrow if I ask you, can you expand a bit more about the frozen assets and how, because we talked about justice and economics more or less. How is it tackled in the ongoing trial of the major figures of the former regime? What's the debate around the frozen assets? Thanks.
That's all. No, about your question, I don't believe totally in this theory of Tunisian exception. It's true that it's a well-developed country and that you have a high level of education and that maybe you, I don't know, historically it's true that Tunisia was until involved directly in military conflicts or with regional and socio-political conflicts with Israel or with I don't know what. So for this reason, yes, we can see that there is a sort of Tunisian exceptionalism. But at the same time, I'm very positive on the process. Actually, I think that really comparing to Egypt or comparing to Yemen or Bahrain or other cases, I think that the process is very developed. I mean, with a constitutional assembly, it means historically speaking, it means something. We are going now, and we are in the process, which will be after 1 or 2 years, the second Republican Tunisian Republic. So yes, there is something historical, and but at the same time. We can say that you can see maybe the same process as in Egypt in a way. I mean, the old regime is still able to act and to there is a sort, I don't like this term, a counter-revolution, you know, because I don't mean exactly what does it mean, but when I spoke about the army and when I said that the army now is maybe a part of a new social contract about security, I think that the possibility of authoritarian democracy is still possible. I mean, it exists, authoritarian democracy. We have cases in Latin America by the past and so on. It's a possibility. We should know that now we have a new government elected with, which is an alliance between Islamists and leftist parties. It's totally clear that part of the old regime doesn't want this solution and doesn't want the inclusion of Islamists in the political process. That's why I always say that when we are thinking about national reconciliation, there are several, in fact, national reconciliation. The first national reconciliation, it's a reconciliation between the poor provinces and the subaltern provinces and the rest of the country in the form of national reconciliation. But the second and important national reconciliation is the reconciliation between two countries, between the conservative Tunisia, which is a reality and who voted for an Ennahda party, and another so-called progressive Tunisia, which exists too. So. But part of the old elite and part of the security apparatus, I'm not so sure that they want this sort of national reconciliation. And really, I think that some of them are waiting one thing now. It's not the fall of this government, but it's a sort of failure of this government on the economic files, on the social files, and so on. And so. Now the real problems, in a way, are really beginning. Concerning your question, Claire, it was about Western positions about the transition in general. That's it.
Yeah, on the frozen assets of the former figures of the regime.
Okay. Concerning the Western. The West, it's very vague too. I think that for one time there is a real willingness to sustain the process. It wasn't totally sure at the beginning, but there is a real willingness, especially coming from the Americans. It's clear. I think that Americans now have a clear view of the situation and think that they can create in a Wilsonian model the new type of perfect democracy in Tunisia, and I think they want it. That's why they are going to sustain all the political forces which will emerge, whether Islamist or leftist or liberals, and in a way we can say that it's positive, because for the moment the Western countries are not going to sustain a counter-revolution or military coup, for example. I think it's not in their view. But the problem is that at the same time, Western countries, in their vast majority, want a sort of political and, above all, economic consensus on certain topics. They want, for example, the position of many Western countries now. Concerning Ennahda, they say, okay, Ennahda, you are totally free to do what you want, but you have to build you have to build a consensus with a part of the old political political elite of Ben Ali. It's very clear. And one of the first signs of Hamadi Jbeli after the election of Ennahda government, it was to meet not the trade union, not the UGTT, not the trade union of the workers. It was to meet the trade union of enterprise. So it was very clear. So Tunisia is very free, but they have to respect a certain type of international consensus about many topics. And concerning the judgments of members of the old regime, I think that it's the same. If there is a consensus for them in Tunisia, it's okay. They can perfectly help. And for example, even France. I spoke about this guy Khaled Ben Said. After all, and despite the French position in general concerning Tunisia by the past, above all, it's the French justice which charged Khaled Ben Said 2 or 3 years ago. So I think there is a general consensus against it, on the transitional process.
I believe we have one last question, and then we'll be finished.
Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm a postdoc in political science at Stanford. I'm just here on holiday. So
okay.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I wanted to push you a little bit more on the question of authoritarian democracy, and I'm not very familiar with the Tunisian case. Most of my work is in Indonesia. In Indonesia, you had a democratic revolution in 1998, kicking out of Suharto, and then the revolution stalled. 15 years later, we're sort of at the same point that we were, 2 or 3 years after the revolution, and that's largely because the political parties never changed. And so now you have democracy but no representation, democracy with no sense of real accountability, democracy but no real economic justice, and that's largely because the political parties are the same faces, and they've been in part co-opted or have a coalition with large scale capitalists, or at least the oligarchs who largely have a lot of financial resources. And so there's been no transitional justice. There's been no real reform. And so I was hoping to push you a little bit more on what's the role of political parties in bringing about transitional justice, or in part impeding it, and whether that model of democracy without accountability or representation might be the future of Tunisia.
About authoritarian democracy, at first it's not my concept, it's a concept written by our friend Vincent Gesser from the French Institute of Near East. He's not here today, but he's working with us on this topic. And we speak about authoritarian democracy because I say that you have in Tunisia clearly from the Islamists to part of the moderate left a general consensus about a deal and political accommodation with a large part of the Interior Ministry and with the army. And the army has a real political role in the actual transition. If we're speaking about authoritarian democracy, it's also because the question and the thematic of the order was really was really present during the campaign for the elections. And Ennahda, it was its own program. Order. We want security and order. We don't want, for example, the last declaration of Ennahda party about this topic. That's it. You have to stop the sit-ins. You have to stop the social mobilizations. You have to stop the demonstrations, because what the Tunisians want now, they want security and order. So I think that this thematic of order and security plays not a bad role, because I can understand that economically it's very hard to have always sit-ins and social demonstrations in the regions, in Tunisia and so on, and that the economical situation is catastrophic, of course. But for the moment, if the solution, I don't know, is the repression against it, yes, it will be a problem. That's why I spoke too about the possibility of a new social explosion in the region. I don't think that the thematic of the order and of security is the better way to solve the problem of the regions which were at the core of the insurrection and of the revolution.
Everybody for coming tonight, and thank you again to Dr. Pouillard for your help and questions.